Her name was Marin, just 17. They said she had smiled too long at a man who wasn't her betrothed. That was all it took. By dusk, the women of the village were summoned to the square, told to watch as her fate was tested. Not by blood or blade, but by her own hair. The sound came first, the low rhythmic scratch of coarse hemp rope dragged against the stones. That sound never left them. They said it clung to the air, to the thatch, to the inside of the skull like a warning that could not be unlearned. Marin was silent when they brought her out. Her braids were long, dark, and carefully woven that morning by her mother. Those same braids would become her trial. The priest called it an ordeal of purity. The crowd called it justice. But justice in that place wore the face of humiliation. They hung her by her braids, the old records whisper, so that her own vanity might bear the weight of her guilt. This is not myth. Across scattered corners of early Europe, from the Baltic to the Carpathians, women were tested by the strength of their hair. If her braids held, she was faithful, favored by God. But if they tore free, if the scalp gave way before confession, she was named impure, shameful, animal. Tonight, in Crimson Archive, we open that bark chapter, the braid-hanging trial, an ancient test that decided a woman's fate by turning her beauty into her punishment. We will explore its roots in religious dogma, its grotesque fascination with pain disguised as purity, and how it became a tool of absolute control over women's bodies and minds. And by the end, we'll see that echoes of this cruelty still survive, disguised, refined, and legal. So stay until the last breath of this story, because what happened to Marin isn't just history, it's a mirror. They tied her to a wooden beam fixed between two poles. The ropes were threaded through her braids, looped and pulled until her toes barely touched the ground. The scratch of rope grew sharper now, fibers groaning under tension. The priest recited verses about the strength of women's virtue. Each word struck like another knot being tied. This was how society measured her worth. By how long she could endure her own pain without breaking, without crying, without confession. Her silence became the evidence of guilt. Her suffering became the entertainment of faith. The air smelled of damp earth and burning wax. The villagers stood close enough to hear the tiny, sickening pop of hair snapping under strain. Some averted their eyes. Others leaned forward, hungry for the moment when her body would fall. But Marin did not scream. Her hands trembled, her legs kicked once, twice, and then steadied. A drop of blood ran down her temple, tangled in the hair that no longer belonged to her. When her mother cried out, the priest silenced her with a single phrase. If she is pure, the braids will hold. The cruelty was always dressed as conviction. For centuries, this ritual spread through whispers of sanctity. Clerics claimed it discerned the truth without torture, yet it left women disfigured, scalped, or worse. The paradox was obscene, a test that punished both the innocent and the accused. To survive was proof of submission. To break was proof of sin. And still, the scratch of rope echoed, a sound that defined power, not faith. You're watching Crimson Archive, where we unearth the rituals that history tried to forget. If you believe truth deserves the light, subscribe, stay with us, because what begins with Marin's braids will unravel into something far larger and far more terrifying than one girl's pain. Her ordeal was not unique. It was systemic, deliberate, and designed to remind every woman who watched her body, her hair, her silence all belonged to someone else. The mechanism was deceptively simple. A piece of rope, a pair of braids, and a crowd desperate to believe that cruelty could be holy.
Every detail was chosen with precision. The ropes were not coarse by accident. They were deliberately frayed to bite deeper into the strands, to ensure each movement tugged at the scalp like fire under the skin. The priest would instruct his assistants, often young boys from the parish, to braid the ends tighter so that the truth may not escape through weakness. That phrase alone tells us everything. In this world, pain was not just tolerated, it was method. The scratch of rope against wood became the rhythm of judgment. The beam groaned as each victim was hoisted, half suspended, half grounded, her toes scraping for balance, her body trembling as if caught between two dimensions, earth and accusation. The doctrine behind the braid hanging trial was rooted in the so-called ordeals of purity, rituals used between the 13th and 16th centuries to test women accused of adultery, witchcraft, or disobedience. Water, fire, iron, all were instruments of divine proof. But hair was intimate. Hair was pride. To use it against her was to turn the symbol of womanhood into her undoing. And that was the point. The trial was never about truth. It was about control. The church's need to mold obedience into the flesh, to make virtue measurable in screams and silence. Imagine the psychology of the moment. A young woman, humiliated before neighbors and kin, suspended by what once made her beautiful. Every second she endured, she was being rewritten from person to object, from daughter to lesson. The crowd would watch her hair stretch and tear strand by strand, and somewhere between horror and fascination, they'd convince themselves that justice was being served, because believing in her guilt was easier than seeing their own complicity. And for the men who orchestrated it, the clerics, the lords, the magistrates, it was never just about punishment. It was theater. It was propaganda disguised as piety. Records from a Lithuanian monastery describe one such scene in cold, bureaucratic language. The woman was tested by her braids. She confessed not before the tearing, but after, for she understood her vanity was the path of sin. Thus, the method is righteous. That single sentence erases everything. It transforms agony into evidence, violence into virtue. The scratch of rope against wood becomes the rhythm of judgment. We often speak of history's cruelty as if it were inevitable, but it wasn't. It was engineered. The braid-hanging trial fit neatly into a system that punished any hint of female autonomy. If she spoke out, she was proud. If she remained silent, she was deceitful. There was no version of her that was safe. In many regions, the same ropes used for this trial were later used to hang confessed witches. The test had evolved, or rather decayed, into execution. And yet, it carried the same twisted logic. Let pain reveal the truth that power already decided. What makes this ritual so horrifying is not its brutality, but its calmness. No screaming torturer, no dungeon dripping with gore, just a priest, a rope, a sermon, and an entire community convinced they were witnessing moral order. The cruelty was procedural, not chaotic. It was written into the law, codified by faith, sanctified by repetition. That's what makes it so chilling. It wasn't madness, it was administration. And as the rope creaked above each trembling woman, the scratch of hemp became more than a sound. It was a language, a reminder that her suffering was not an accident. It was policy. Some historians argue that the ritual faded with the Reformation. Others suggest it persisted quietly, disguised as domestic correction. But the logic never died. It changed clothes. Because whenever a system tells a woman her pain is proof of her purity, that endurance equals worthiness, the rope still hangs in the shadows. The sound may have softened through the centuries, but listen closely. You can still hear it, faint and familiar. That slow, deliberate scratch of rope tightening just beyond sight. And next, we'll uncover what happened when the women stopped believing the lies and decided to turn that sound against their oppressors.
It began quietly, as all revolutions do. The year was 1584, in a small town near the Baltic coast. A woman named Elka refused to confess. Her hair, already torn from a previous trial, hung in ragged patches. The priest ordered her to be rebraided to restore the instrument of truth. But Elka smiled. That was her rebellion. A smile. Small, defiant, and utterly unforgivable. They tied the ropes again, looped them through what was left of her hair. The scratch of hemp sounded softer now, less a test, more a warning. Yet before the priest could begin his prayer, Elka spoke, not to him, but to the women watching. "Do you hear it?" she said. "The rope sings for all of us." The crowd froze. To speak during the ordeal was heresy. To speak to the others was worse. It meant she had turned the ritual outward, shifted the gaze, made them witnesses instead of believers. That moment spread like wildfire. Within a year, reports appeared of villages refusing to perform the trial. Priests who ordered it found their ropes stolen, their pulpits defaced. In one region, the women shaved their heads in solidarity, declaring no hair, no trial. It was not only rebellion, it was reclamation. The weapon had been dismantled, strand by strand. But power never yields quietly. By 1591, new decrees were written. Any woman who removed her hair before trial would be flogged for defiance of God's design. The system adapted, always searching for new ways to reassert control. They could not hang them by their braids anymore, so they found new ropes, invisible ones: gossip, shame, doctrine. The scratch of rope never truly ceased. It simply changed texture, from fiber to word. One story survives in chilling detail. A traveling scribe, employed by a bishop, described an execution in the margins of his ledger. The woman laughed as they bound her. She said she pitied us, for we believed the rope was stronger than mercy. The crowd did not know whether to weep or cheer. The priest fled the next day. It's a brief note, almost careless, but it marks a rupture in the narrative, the moment the ritual lost its sanctity. For the first time, the people began to question not the women, but the men who condemned them. And that was the true danger. Because once a society sees cruelty as absurd, it collapses the illusion of righteousness that sustains it. The braid hanging trial began to vanish from official records around the early 1600s, buried under the weight of embarrassment and reform. But silence is not erasure. The memory persisted, whispered in lullabies and family warnings: braid gently, child, and never trust a man with rope. Still, history has a cruel habit of repetition. In the 19th century, certain tests of fidelity reappeared across patriarchal cultures, not by rope, but by endurance, by humiliation, by obedience. The form evolved, but the intent was identical: to measure a woman's worth by her willingness to suffer. And then comes the shock we almost missed. In 1908, an excavation near Vilnius unearthed a beam, charred but intact, with strands of human hair fused into the wood. Chemical analysis confirmed: female,
aged between 15 and 20. But the beam was not found in a church. It was found beneath a farmhouse, one that had been used for town meetings well into the 18th century, meaning the trial did not vanish when the records said it did. It went underground. It continued, not as law, but as custom, carried out quietly, justified as discipline, hidden beneath generations of respectability. The scratch of rope once again echoes, faint but familiar, across centuries. It's in the way history sanitizes itself, the way archives omit what cannot be justified, the way the sound of suffering is repackaged as moral order. When you hear that sound, in laws that call pain reform, in systems that call silence virtue, remember Marin, Elka, and every nameless girl who learned too late that truth was never the goal. And as we descend into the final act, the question isn't whether the rope broke. It's whether we ever did.
Centuries have passed since the last braid bore the weight of judgment, and yet the scratch of rope still lingers. You can almost hear it in the quiet spaces between headlines, in the way society still asks women to prove themselves through pain. It's not the hemp rope anymore, it's subtler now. Policies, expectations, reputations stretch thin until they break. The modern world calls it tradition, or respectability, or honor. But the sound remains the same, the tightening of control disguised as morality. Listen closely and you'll hear it in the question still asked of women. What were you wearing? Why didn't you speak sooner? Who were you with? Each question is a strand pulled tighter, each demand for explanation a small deliberate yank at the roots of her dignity. Because the braid, even now, is symbolic, a fusion of beauty, identity, and restraint. What was once a literal noose of hair has become a social one, woven by expectations that insist on compliance. History never died, it reincarnated. In parts of the world today, women are still subjected to purity tests, still humiliated publicly for imagined dishonor. Some are forced to endure rituals that prove nothing except the persistence of cruelty. And each time a system turns suffering into spectacle, it resurrects that ancient square, the crowd watching, the priest reciting, the rope whispering against the beam. We like to imagine that progress means distance, but it doesn't. It means disguise. The methods have grown quieter, more polished, more administrative. The trials happen behind closed doors, in courtrooms, in board meetings, in marriages that measure loyalty in silence. The world no longer calls it a hanging, but it still calls it justice. There's a reason this story needed to be told, not for spectacle, not for horror's sake, but to expose the machinery of cruelty itself. Because when we forget its shape, we risk rebuilding it. The braid hanging trial was never just a punishment. It was a ritual of obedience, a script rehearsed by an entire culture that believed pain could make truth visible. And though the ropes have rotted, the instinct remains to see endurance as virtue, to equate silence with grace, and to measure worth by how much one can suffer without breaking. But what happens when the rope finally snaps? When the strands of false morality give way and the truth falls free? Marin's story, Elka's defiance, the nameless girls whose hair was taken from them remind us of something vital. Cruelty is never ancient. It is present, continuous, adaptive. It feeds on the same justifications in every century. And yet, so does resistance. Every time someone refuses to confess to a crime that is simply being themselves, every time a person reclaims what the world tried to shame, another strand of the rope frays, another trial ends mid-sentence. That's why we tell these stories. because remembering them isn't nostalgia, it's survival. The scratch of rope fades now, not because it has vanished, but because someone finally let go. If you've stayed this long, you already understand. This channel isn't just about history. It's about memory, justice, and the cost of forgetting. You're watching Crimson Archive, where the past is not buried, but exhumed. If these truths stir something in you, if you believe the unspoken deserves to be heard, join us, subscribe, share, and carry the story forward. Because the rope's echo ends only when we stop pulling it tight. So remember Marin, her silence, her strength, her defiance suspended in that single terrible sound. And ask yourself, when cruelty calls itself faith, who will be the first to cut the rope? The rope still hangs in history's rafters, but tonight, in the telling, it finally begins to loosen.